Thank you for joining us for our first Lunch and Learn event of the semester from the Benedictine Institute. It's wonderful to have you with us. Even though it's the first, it sort of feels like one of the later ones, doesn't it? Because given the weather outside, I hope so. Hopefully, maybe by our last one this semester, it'll be like 80 degrees. Who knows? I'm Dr. Roger Narlock. I'm director of the Benedictine Institute. And before I introduce our speaker today, I would first like to do a very brief introduction of our new staff member in the Benedictine Institute. We recently hired another position. So before the Benedictine Institute was just the director and the administrative assistant, and starting in January, we now have an associate director, and who is familiar to a whole lot of you, and that's Jesse Bazan, who will come up here and lead us in a prayer before we get going.
Thank you. And let us pray. Generous God, you sent your Son Jesus into the world to be a wellspring of healing and wholeness. We give you thanks for the many ways in which the Sisters of St. Benedict's Monastery have embodied Christ's healing presence for decades, particularly through their healthcare ministries. Inspire all of us gathered here to approach those in need with the same generous spirit as the sisters and their founder, St. Benedict, who wrote in his rule that care of the sick must rank above and before all else, so that they may truly be served as Christ. We offer this prayer in your holy name. Amen.
Thank you so much. So now to the introduction of our speaker today. Our speaker is Mr. Brendon Duffy. And Brendon originally hails from Davenport, Iowa. Wow. He did his undergraduate degree at St. Norbert's College in Wisconsin, so if any of the Breeses were here, then I would expect the woo for that. Majoring in English and communication. Brendon found his way to St. John's where he completed his Master's of Divinity at the School of Theology, and afterwards served as the head of admissions for the School of Theology for 13 years. He moved to the position of archivist for Centricare in 2016, where he, along with many, many volunteers, is responsible for collecting, preserving, and sharing the history and legacy of the 9 hospitals and more than 30 clinics of Centricare. Learning about and sharing history are a central theme in Brendon's life. In his free time, he is a serious genealogist, including having written a 300-page family history book for his family. Also, and I learned this about him a long time ago, so I hope I have the details right here. When growing up, his parents would give each child in the family a turn at deciding where the whole family would then go on their family vacation. Much to his siblings' dismay, Brendon did not choose destinations like Disney World or the beach, but instead chose trips to visit grave sites and libraries of former presidents. Now that's a passion for history. I'm grateful to have Brendon with us today to not only share his passion for history, but to detail the passion of the Sisters of St. Benedict and that they have for healthcare in central Minnesota. So join me in welcoming Brendon. Did I get that right?
Thank you. That was right. Sadly, that is true. Can't believe you remembered that. My brother wanted to go to Major League Baseball parks. Everybody liked that a lot better. So I'm going to cover the history of the sisters' contribution to healthcare in central Minnesota. So I'm going to try to cover about 140 years of history in a half an hour. So we'll touch on just a few kind of highlights. Just hopefully there will be things that even if you thought you knew this whole story, there will be some things in here that you didn't know. But we'll give it a shot. And then at the end, I'll have some time for questions if anybody has anything to add or ask about. So we'll start with, these are kind of the two founders of hospital care in central Minnesota. So the guy on the left is Dr. Lamoth Ramsey. He came to St. Cloud in the mid-1880s. He had gone to Rush Medical College, where he really developed all of the most modern surgical techniques. St. Cloud was a pretty new city then, and he was Catholic, and he married one of the Foley sisters that the city of Foley is named after. And so he was pretty connected around the area, and they were connected a little bit to the sisters, so he thought, I need someone, I can't run a hospital and do my practice. He tried for a little while and couldn't, and so he decided to ask the sisters if they'd ever be interested in getting into hospital care. Now, the sisters really were more focused on education, and they really came here because they were here to educate the German Catholics that had moved to the area, and so they had not gone into hospital care in the past and decided to pray and think about if they wanted to get into hospital care at all. So thank you, Jesse, for the lead-in. But this is the actual part of the Rule of Benedict that really guided them the entire time that they were in hospital care. But when they prayed about this and thought about it, they thought this quote from the Rule of Benedict, chapter 36, which is based on Matthew chapter 25, this really led them into deciding to get into healthcare. So, of course, they needed money, and they decided to write to the City Council of St. Cloud to see if they would be willing to donate $10,000 to establish a hospital in St. Cloud. And I'm going to have trouble reading this, but basically they asked for $10,000, and they were also trying to work off of, there were two distinct groups of immigrants in the St. Cloud area at the time, and it was the Yankees from the East who had come early, and then the German Catholics who had come later. And those two groups were kind of separate, but the sisters really didn't have a lot of credibility with the St. Cloud area. So they were really kind of also trying to establish, like, hey, we would take care of everybody no matter what. So our CEO, who doesn't really know a lot about sisters, I feel like we're always teaching him about the traditions here, he loves this letter because it really shows that no matter who the other is, that is what we're always charged to do, is to take care of everyone, no matter who it is, and we still really try to live by that. And so the sisters didn't get any money from the city of St. Cloud or anybody else, but they still started a hospital. So this was the very first hospital that opened in February of 1886. It was at the corner of 9th Avenue North and 5th Street North, which then was called State Street. It was a brand new building. It had 15 hospital beds. There was a beautiful bay window for surgery, which would now be infection control's worst nightmare. And but you needed natural light, and so that was one way they could get that. The sisters lived on the 3rd floor of this building who worked at the hospital, and it was very slow going. In the first 2 months, they only had 10 patients. And part of that was because people had an impression of hospitals that it was a place that people went to die. It wasn't a place people went to get better. And Dr. Ramsey was still trying to convince people you could get better from surgery. I wouldn't have wanted to try it at the time, but I'm sure there were good things that happened. And the sisters, I think, were really going, what did we get ourselves into? We're giving all this labor and all this money, and it's not going very well. And people weren't responding to it in the way that they had hoped. So they decided that for 9 days straight, they were going to pray for guidance from God about if they should even stay in this ministry at all. Now, I know there's a lot of sisters here, and we would never want to give the impression that that led to this, but on April 14th, 1886, which was day 5 of their 9-day prayer ritual, the biggest, still deadliest tornado ever in the history of Minnesota happened in Stearns County and Benton County, actually. And so this tornado whipped through St. Cloud, actually sparing the hospital, but went right through Sauk Rapids and Rice, and it killed 72 people and injured more than 250. And if you think about how long, this is actually Sauk Rapids on the river in 1886, looking over at St. Cloud. And so if you think about how long it would have taken to get that news, for 48 hours, the sisters had to care for people before help could arrive from the Twin Cities and other parts of the state to help them. So because of this disaster, it really convinced people that we needed a hospital in central Minnesota, and also really cemented the sisters' role as being good at healthcare. And so that really was a saving grace for them and was a good thing that came out of that disaster. They also realized their current space with the 15 beds on 9th Avenue was not sufficient. So a couple people came to them and said, hey, we have some land we'd like to give you if you'd be willing to move the hospital. So this hospital was built in 1890 in southeast St. Cloud. It would now be close to where St. Scholastica Convent and St. Benedict Senior Community is located. So this was the hospital from 1890 to 1900. The sisters went there with the understanding that, hey, if you build it, they will come. We'll get nicer roads there. We'll get a bridge across the river. None of that ever happened. And so it was there. They were there for about 10 years, and then went, we want to get closer back to downtown St. Cloud. So how could we do that? So in 1900, they built St. Raphael's Hospital, which, does anybody recognize this building? It's still standing. It's actually Place of Hope in St. Cloud now on 9th Avenue, which is very close to the first hospital. Actually was kind of in the same block, but this building still stands, not quite looking like this. I love seeing the person like out on the porch on the second floor there. And we actually have one of those uniforms in the archives. But so they actually built this 4-floor building. It had 70 beds. It was a very large place. 5 years into this journey, they had a terrible fire that pretty much gutted the top 2 floors of the hospital, and they were forced to rebuild. And what were most things in a hospital made out of then? Wood. And so it was a very devastating fire, but they, went through it. This is actually what St. Raphael's Hospital looked like, and it was the hospital, the main hospital in St. Cloud until 1928. At the same time that these things were happening, there were major regulations that were coming through related to healthcare. The state of Minnesota first established the Nursing License Board in 1907. So it became like, it can't just be like, you can't just learn on the job. We need to have some regulations here and licensing related to nurses. So the St. Cloud Hospital and the sisters decided 2 things. First of all, they wanted to get people licensed. They also wanted to encourage people to consider healthcare careers and bring in more people. So this actually was the first class of St. Raphael's Training School for Nurses, which became the St. Cloud Hospital School of Nursing, and was around until 1987. In that time, they graduated about 3,000 nurses, which my wife's a nurse, and she just said, wow, if you were in central Minnesota, you had a lot of opportunities if you didn't want to be a farm wife. There were a lot of opportunities for women because you think about it, they had all the programs that were here at the college, and then also at the same time the college was opening, we had the School of Nursing in St. Cloud. And the sisters actually founded 4 different schools that all operated, one for the lab, one for anesthesiology nurses, and X-ray. So all 3 of those were founded by the sisters and educated thousands of healthcare people. The lady who is in the front of this class, the very first class of the School of Nursing, front left, is Sister Julita Hoppy. And our auditorium is still named after her at St. Cloud Hospital. She really was, I would say, the driving force behind building what's currently the St. Cloud Hospital. And she was a nurse in that first class, so she was very young and was actually, what happened in 1918 that probably would have shaped you if you were a pretty new nurse? The flu, right? And so it was World War I, it was influenza, and this was a terrible place to be in the 1918 flu. Actually, there was a building across from what's now St. Mary's Cathedral. It was then called St. Mary's Church, but it was called the Institute. Does anybody remember that? Yep. And the Institute was actually an emergency hospital during the 1918 flu. And Sister Julita was one of the young nurses who lived long enough to be able to record that story and tell what it was like being a new nurse and living there. So, should I read this or can you all read it? Okay. We only had a few beds set up when the patients began to come. We got very little rest that night as the patients needed care. The schools had been closed, and so the sisters came to help from almost every one of our convents, and they helped until they too were sick with the flu. One woman admitted all the patients, and the kitchen provided food and drink for all of them. Every day, Bishop Bush came and blessed the sick with the relic of St. Cloud. We took care of more than 400 patients in the 7 to 8 weeks. And so that all happened at a site off-site from the hospital. And she tells terrible stories that I wouldn't want to. Is everyone done with lunch? But it's stuff like, funeral directors wouldn't pick up the bodies, and families were split up because they didn't know how they were catching it. It was just a terrible time to be in healthcare. And those sisters really got us through the 1918 flu. That also served as, she really figured out that St. Raphael's was not well equipped to deal with a major situation if that happened again. And so she really used that experience to motivate both the sisters and motivate the greater community that we needed a bigger hospital and the community was growing. So she was the driving force really behind building the St. Cloud Hospital. And I think when this was being built, I think people thought they were crazy. We don't need a hospital this big. The cities is however far away. And this is just, outrageous. And so at the time, the sisters got approval for a $2 million loan to build this hospital on the banks of the Mississippi. And so if you think about this too, so took 2 years to build, and it was built from 1926 to 28. So they're now sitting on a $2 million loan with a new hospital. What happened in 1928? Stock market crashed, right? So if it even would have been 2 years later, they probably never would have gotten approved for the money. And yet, I guess good they got approved for the money, except that the stock market crashed. So that was a major problem. So I love this picture because everyone always thinks that the St. Cloud Hospital took over the neighborhood, but there really wasn't very much of a neighborhood. It almost looks like when you look at those old plat maps and there's like one house every square, it really was pretty out in the country. It's now in the middle of town, but it really was rural property when St. Cloud Hospital was built. People get mad now because you could park right next to it too. So just to give a little insight into, and some of you who work at St. John's and St. Ben's will also understand this, but the way that religious institutions, and in particular with Benedictines, how they were structured, how the community related to what their different apostolates were. So the corporate structure from 1886 really to the early 1960s, the Sisters of the Order of St. Benedict here in St. Joe, they would have owned the hospital and all of its buildings. They would have operated, so they would have been in charge for hiring and firing and managing all the stuff that goes with a hospital. They would have governed, so actually the prioress of St. Ben's Monastery, just by default, was also the chair of the hospital board. So that person maybe wouldn't necessarily know anything about healthcare, but she would have ultimately been in charge of big decisions at the hospital. And then also maintained. So anything that was, happening at the hospital or going wrong with the hospital would have been their responsibility to fix. These are some examples. I just love these pictures because it really kind of illustrates what was happening at the hospital. This was a management meeting in 1953. And so still almost all of the people did I say 53? I actually mean 63. But as late as 63. So I love that the sister second from the front on the right-hand side, she's going to be 101 next month, and she still identifies pictures for me. and I actually have her desk. I have a picture of her sitting at it in the 60s. Kind of fun. But this was the management meeting. Now, the sisters that are in white are the ones that really worked in patient care, and the sisters that are in black, were people wondering that? The people who are in black were more like administrative type people. This is one of my favorites. So these are sister DJs. They literally did everything at the hospital. So they had a radio station, you had a pillow radio in your hospital room, and they would sometimes play religious tunes, or they might play some current hits. But I think just like now with technology, the younger sisters were kind of like, hey, you're under 30, you could be a DJ. And the radio station was called, get ready to groan, WELL. This is actually during the polio epidemic. So we were a major hub for polio, and we were one of the first places in the country who got the polio vaccine. And when it was time for, we actually in 1 week inoculated 30,000 kids in Stearns and Benton County for polio. And this shows the sisters getting ready and getting all these needles, and they called it Operation Lollipop. So we have pictures of kids who were crying right after they got their polio shot. They got a lollipop. So. And this is students in the School of Nursing learning how to properly give a tray to a patient. They were getting trained here when they were students. And Sister Paula Revere, who always had a clipboard, is making sure they're doing it right. And I just love these. So top right is Sister Honora, who would have been involved with x-rays. She's showing a couple of x-ray techs how to do x-rays. And the left-hand side, this is the School of Anesthesia. There were 2 sisters who ran the School of Anesthesia. Bottom right is Sister Rebecca, who was a pharmacist. So I just love that they were the leaders in all of these healthcare areas in our area, and I think a lot of people don't realize it. So by the early 1960s, it was really a trend in healthcare, but in particular in Catholic healthcare, to consider separately incorporating, just like the colleges did here. But it's sort of like, this all sounds great. Why would we want to separately incorporate? Well, there were a few reasons. It would limit your exposure to liability. So healthcare was getting very expensive, and the stakes were pretty high. So if there was ever a problem with healthcare, you wouldn't want to lose the monastery because there was a malpractice suit at the hospital or something. And really, the Catholic Health Association was really advocating for that. Also, it was getting to be more complicated to run a hospital. Healthcare was getting more specialized. It wasn't like, oh, hey, you just came and we do everything here. We were attracting more employees and physicians from other places because healthcare just got more specialized, like everything. There was also increasing accountability to state and federal government. So similar to here, it used to be the sisters or monks at St. John's lived at work. And so the sisters who worked at the hospital, they lived at the hospital. I heard these stories about when sisters finally got a day off, they actually wouldn't know what to do because they were so used to just basically living at work and working all the time. And they also got all their meals there, and it was becoming more like, we can't really do that anymore because that's not the way that government regulation would work. Also, the hospital by this time was approaching 40 years old, and we had never done a major renovation or addition. And with the increase in specialized care, they knew they were going to have to do that. And the possibility of government funding really wouldn't have been possible with it being a religious organization. So having it be a nonprofit that was not connected to a religious community by ownership would help them get more federal funding. So we started doing construction in the late 60s and never stopped after that. Also, the number of women joining religious communities just changed drastically. So I think we probably know this, but in the late 1950s, early 1960s, there were 1,200 sisters in the community just here in St. Joe. So you think about just the the people power of that, managing all of these educational and healthcare institutions that they were, it was just a big difference. And hiring people from outside the monastery also would require more money. The other big thing that happened, and these were all happening at the same time, it's kind of crazy, but Medicare was also being signed into regulation in 1965. This affected how employees could be compensated, how healthcare was billed, how we were reimbursed for healthcare, like were we an urban or a rural hospital. We were just going through lots and lots of changes related to that as well. So in 1962, the St. Cloud Hospital was separately incorporated as a not-for-profit corporation under the statutes of Minnesota. The hospital and its property, though, were still owned by the Sisters of St. Benedict. So the management of the hospital was sort of separated into the St. Cloud Hospital Corporation. And then I also have, the Second Vatican Council then was also happening at this exact same time, which would have been, we're probably familiar with most of this, but it was a really big change in the Catholic Church, which would have affected both sisters, Catholic healthcare, all of this. It lasted for 3 years in the middle of all these other things that were happening with healthcare changes and addressed the relationship between the Catholic Church and the modern world. It also called for more involvement in institutions from lay people and for a renewal of vowed religious life. So how did this look at St. Cloud Hospital? The real estate, so this was only 2 years after the St. Cloud Hospital Corporation was established, the real estate of the St. Cloud Hospital was transferred to the St. Cloud Hospital Corporation from the Sisters of the Order of St. Benedict as a charitable gift. It was recorded in Stearns County for the amount of $1. Did anybody not know that? Okay. Yeah, I just think it's like one of those things, like the more I learn about this, it's shocking to me still. Because really, you see these places where people are selling their hospitals for millions of dollars. The sisters donated the hospital for $1 to the community. A detailed study was done by an auditor who determined that the monies sent to the sisters from the hospital had satisfied the debt owed to the hospital by the sisters. It's kind of complicated, but really, the sisters carried that $2 million debt and then also basically worked for 40 years at the hospital. It's a really huge gift. This was something that one of the sisters told me, and I just love it. She said that people had the impression who worked at the hospital or in the community that like there was just a big stash of money that got driven out to the monastery here at St. Ben's every day. Like everybody was just paying their, and I've seen the bills, like hospital bills from the 1950s, and it'll be like, you were here for 4 days, okay, that'll be $42. And so until 1962, excess funds were sent to the monastery from all of its missions for the operation of the religious community. The money sent to the community for the last 5 years accounted for 40% of the money that was sent for 1928 to 1962. So in 1955, the hospital was still operating with a $90,000 annual deficit. It's kind of shocking, really, that they kept going. This is actually shortly after the sisters gifted the hospital. They were also coming up with, how do the sisters now relate to the hospital and what does that look like? And so one of the ways they did that was to have sisters involved in leadership in different ways. This was the first administrative council meeting of the hospital. And Sister Colleen Haggerty is on the right-hand side. She was one of the 2 sisters that was on that administrative council. She just died a couple of weeks ago and was a really good friend to the archives. And she's not smiling in that picture. She's smiling in almost every picture. And I asked her why one time, and she said, do you know why? And I said, no. She said, that was the first day we had our modified habits, that day. So she showed up, she goes, nobody at work had ever seen my hair or my neck. And she said, I felt so vulnerable, so it was too much change in one day. And lots of questions from Vatican II still really were present for the sisters and for the hospital. What did it mean to be a hospital operating under the auspices of the Catholic Church? So what does that mean? What did it mean to be a community, both as a hospital and as a group of vowed religious? and what does it mean to be a religious sister in today's world? So, we saw the modified habit, but really the role of sisters was drastically changing in how they related to people. And I can tell even when I look in our publications at the hospital, in the early 1960s, the sisters didn't have last names. It was just like Sister Mary, but we never said her last name, so it's very hard to find people. But they just became much more accessible to people after Vatican II. So just to give a few ideas, so we're thinking 1967, they get the modified habit, right? Sister Colleen is really into this by 1970. So this is the hospital picnic. And so you think they didn't know their last names, and they never saw their neck or hair. They're in a pie eating contest at the hospital picnic in 1970. They just became much more accessible to people and human. The sisters also no longer lived on hospital property. So they weren't living in the hospital building, basically not living at work, but they lived in this house that was across the street from the hospital. So this shows a group of sisters. I'm going to use this because we have to do safety moments at work. I'm going to use the one on the right for my safety moment. But that's three of the sisters shoveling the roof at the house. And this house actually, I don't know if anybody will remember this, but it was before the Gorecki guest house. This house stood there, and it was called the River Oaks guest house. But in the 70s and 80s, the sisters actually lived in that house. Again, this is Sister Colleen. So this is the 50th anniversary of St. Cloud Hospital. They were doing displays to kind of educate people and get them to consider healthcare work. And she's at the mall doing displays, about the hospital. So just again, super accessible to people in a different way than they had been in the past. And so we were looking at, what is sponsorship? Support of, influence on, and responsibility for an institution, program, or project that furthers the objectives of the sponsoring group. So the sisters were really moving into a relationship of sponsorship to the hospital and to the college. The form of sponsorship may be in people, facilities, money, or merely an identification with the sponsoring group's name. So that's kind of how they were relating to the hospital after that. I'm going to keep going because I want to have enough time for questions. So in 1967, we appointed our first non-sister administrator to chief administrator at the hospital. The administrative team, which you saw, consisted of 2 sisters, 3 lay employees, and the chief medical officer. And sisters who were employed at the hospital were now paid at lay equivalency. So in a way, it was all internal money, and the sisters' salaries were almost never factored into the hospital budget. But now all of a sudden, the sisters were being paid as if they were an outside employee, and that money was then paid back to the monastery. Membership on the board of directors was broadened to include lay people. The board now consisted of 3 sisters, 1 member of the medical staff, and 2 lay people, 1 Catholic and 1 non-Catholic. The administrator and prioress served as ex officio members. So these are examples of the hospital board in the late 60s, early 70s. And you can tell it expanded. And it's funny, some of you recognize toward the back on the right-hand side is Stanley Azerta, who was the president of St. Ben's. And so there was always kind of a link between St. Ben's and the hospital. And I think part of that, too, was also the bachelor's programs in nursing were starting to increase as well. And there was always kind of a relationship education-wise for that. In 1975, the Roman Catholic Diocese of St. Cloud became co-sponsors of the St. Cloud Hospital with the Sisters of the Order of St. Benedict. And that's really still how that's set up, is those 2 groups are still present on the corporate membership of St. Cloud Hospital. So currently, we have 4 ex officio members on the St. Cloud Hospital Board, 2 from the Diocese of St. Cloud and 2 from the Sisters of the Order of St. Benedict. 2 to 4 other members are elected by majority. So we still have, and those pictures are kind of in the hallways, so people know that's the sisters still have a presence there. I just liked these quotes. I went through lots and lots of minutes and meetings to kind of go, so also when the sisters actually decided to give the hospital up for $1, it wasn't mentioned in the chapter minutes of that month, but they mentioned that they were buying a new laundry machine at the hospital. So it's like sometimes I think the way things were decided maybe was a little more closer in the leadership. And it wasn't like the sisters voted on something like this. So I really was looking for, how did the sisters feel about this? What did they think about it? And this was one meeting that I had really, really good minutes of where the sisters were all involved in what it meant. The difficult and trying times of early years remind one of bringing new life to birth with pain and tribulation, and this giving can't be measured or repaid with dollars. It was sponsorship then, too. Perhaps we are one step further, like letting the child grow up and supporting it in a new way without the tangible money investment, but in a sponsoring way. And sponsorship is a community commitment and endeavor, and the strength of community is for each individual. I had the opportunity to interview the attorney who had been the attorney for St. Cloud Hospital for a long time when the sisters were running it, and actually was involved in helping set up Centricare. And I interviewed him kind of for his perspective when these arrangements were being made. And I just had one quote that I think should work.
And the sisters' contribution to the evolution of what is today St. Cloud Hospital is remarkable. Incredible and complete. I mean, it would not be here, or what is here would not be here. I suppose we'd have a hospital, we'd have a city hospital or something, but it's undeniable, undeniable. And the personal sacrifice of the women who were the sisters who worked there is undeniable.
So I got him. He's a really serious attorney, and I got him to sign my oral history release form, which is one of my greatest accomplishments ever. It took 3 rounds to get him to sign it. That's what I've got. Does anybody have any questions? That's a lot of history. Sorry it's so much, but. Yes?
So where did the first $10,000 come from?
Gosh, that's a really good question. Where did the first $10,000? You know, I think it was community fundraising. And they did get some, but I think Dr. Ramsey also chipped in for that too. Yeah, they did get some help, but it wasn't from the city council. Yeah. And when they did the $2 million, they did a fund drive too. They got $55,000 of the $2 million fundraised. Anybody else have any questions? Yeah.
Just to put the charitable aspect in context, have you looked into what other orders did? I know that many sold their property to the community and were able to provide them for themselves to continue doing other ministries and whatnot. I think it's important to acknowledge that. And then, I don't know if this is true, Sister Lenny, but in some conversations I had with Sister I work closely with, the sisters would have to make some decisions in regards to the college that they had founded and were supporting, sometimes in relation to the hospital's needs. There might be a year when they had to buy a new piece of equipment and therefore didn't update something on the college community. Those sacrifices.
Can people hear that?
The context.
Okay. Yes, I think I haven't done a lot of research on that. It's mostly anecdotal, but I've definitely heard about that because if you think about it, it was all one pot of money. And so the sisters were deciding together, or some people were deciding together what was going to get the money at the time. And definitely I think that happened. And I remember I asked Kevin Hughes about basically, you see these groups of sisters that sell big hospitals now. I don't think that was as popular in the 60s as it was later. But also when I said to him, do you think the sisters, are you surprised they didn't sell? And he goes, that isn't even the way the sisters thought. They were always for the good of the greater community. It would have been countercultural for them to think of it in that way, and they never would do that even now. I thought that was pretty impressive, actually. Yes?
one of the things that many communities have done over the years, even at that time when they did move the hospital on, give it to somebody, was to get health care in perpetuity. And that was something, again, that the sisters here did not do. And as regards paying off the debt, I have lived with one of our sisters who came to Eau Claire to start the community there, who was a young sister, and she said they did not have enough to eat because they were trying to pay the debt off. And she still, because she was so young when this happened, she still had neurological effects from it that the doctor told her happened because she didn't have enough to eat at that time. So this wasn't just sacrifice, but it was, they weren't getting some of the nice things. They weren't getting the basics.
Yes.
I'm curious with the School of Nursing, did the sisters always run that up until?
So the School of Nursing was part of the hospital. So it kind of was part of the hospital corporation, but there always was a sister who was the director of the School of Nursing. So even until it closed in 1987, there was still a sister that was the director of the School of Nursing. And there were lots of sisters who were still employed at the hospital then, but it wasn't like the School of Nursing was still run by the sisters separately or something. It was part of the hospital. Yeah. Yes.
Do you have any sense what percentage of the sisters were involved in healthcare as opposed to education or all the other things they were doing? It just seems like such a mammoth job.
I know. I don't know. That's a really good question that I don't know the answer to. We have a list, kind of like Peggy has a list at the college of every sister who ever was involved at St. Cloud Hospital. But the other thing is the sisters at St. Ben's had 4 hospitals at one time. The St. Cloud Hospital was just the closest one. They had one in Ogden, Utah, and they had one in Bismarck, North Dakota. Duluth, yeah. And so, actually, no, Duluth wasn't. New Prague. Duluth was the Duluth Benedictines, and Mother Scholastica left to go to Duluth. Controversial. But you think about that too. So not even just at St. Cloud Hospital, but in healthcare in general, I would be curious about that though. Yeah.
The list you refer to is the sisters who worked for the Claws or something. But there's also, if you don't know it, in the back of With Lamps Burning, there's this wonderful list that the sisters compiled of all the ministries that they did, all the schools, all the hospitals, all the institutions that they ran. It's really amazing.
Yeah. Yes.
Yeah, I'd just like to say a word of thank you to the sisters in the room. As someone who has experienced healthcare at the St. Cloud Hospital and thought that, that was a really special connection to you all, knowing just a little bit of this, and Brendon, thank you for your presentation, it was super moving. I never imagined I would birth my first or any of my children on the edge of the Mississippi River. But I did, and each time I had a gorgeous scenic view. But even more so, right before the eve of the birth of my first child, I was at Mass praying with the sisters, and you all sent me off with a beautiful song of blessing in front of the whole community. And so just thank you for the health care that you provided for this community, as well as the spiritual care that you give now, and I know will continue to give. So thank you all.
Thank you, Margaret. That's a beautiful note to end on. And really, Brendon, one more time, thank you so much for your good work. Couple quick announcements. So our building community events, the weekly time of free pastries and riveting conversation, happens every Friday during the academic year, 9 to 10:45. This coming Friday will be at the SJU Learning Commons. And then the following week, February 9th, will be a special one in the Gathering Place at St. Ben's Monastery. I've been told the sisters will be baking some homemade treats, so be sure to stop by and join for that. Second, we've got applications are live for next year's Benedictine Living and Learning Community. This is an opportunity for students to live in intentional community and take a 1-credit class to learn more about Benedictine spirituality. So if you know of any current first-year students or sophomores who may be interested, please let me know and I'll send them more details. And then last, we're 2 weeks out from the start of Lent, almost 2 weeks out. So Benedictine Institute is going to sponsor a Lenten reflection series using the book Pilgrim Road, A Benedictine Journey Through Lent. More information about that will be up on the bulletin board. The Spirituality Center at St. Ben's also has some lovely Lenten offerings, so we'll journey in prayer together. Thank you all for coming, and we'll see you next time.